Welcome, everybody, to the seventh in our talks, our Windrush Generation talks, where we look back at our Windrush Generation. I know we're in close to term time. We're delighted to be joined by Aisha Thomas, a good friend of mine, educator, and she is a self-declared born and bred Bristolian. It's one of our alumni. It's one of our own. Switched to education in 2010 from studying law. Director of Representations Matters in the City Academy's assistant principal and specialist leader in education for equality, diversity and inclusion and the community. Former TED Talk speaker as well, a number of educational media projects, been on the telly, and you'll see her on Watch YouTube bemoaning the fact of educational black teachers, a subject she's going to be talking about today. In fact, she presented that BBC documentary about that. Part of the Bristol One curriculum, and also supporting me with our city conversations as well in the city, and we're also looking at how to better include education within one of the key factors in tackling that disparity. And delighted, as I say, Aisha's our seventh in our speakers today. I've been one as well. We thank again people like Mayor Marvin Rees, Councillor Carol Thomas, Adam Murray, Michael Jenkins, Latoya McAllister Jones. We had Pat Rose and Laura Chacon. So we're doing an illustrious list as we pause until we go to Windrush Day. This is especially for that influence from people who came from the Caribbean, but also celebrating migration, also celebrating contribution from the Commonwealth. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Aisha Thomas. Take it away, Aisha.
Thank you very much. So good evening. Thank you for everyone coming this evening. I really appreciate your presence. And Roger, thank you for inviting me. I feel very honoured. When I heard the list, I was like, oh, goodness, what a audience to be part of. So thank you very much for allowing me to speak just briefly about my experiences. And just never forget to thank those who've organised the technology. It's not easy, so thank you for that as well. So I guess I just wanted to spend a little bit of time before we delve into kind of questions and a bit more information about my experience, but just to talk about who I am and where I come from and where I really sit. And I've just got a slide up that really talks about some of the really important things that make me me, but also contribute to where I am in terms of the Windrush generation and where I come from. So I identify as a black female. I am of Caribbean heritage, and both sets of my grandparents come from Jamaica. And so I'm very proud of that, and I'm very proud and honoured to talk about where I come from and who I am and what makes me me. I'm very proud that both sets of my grandparents and my great-grandparents from my maternal side were able to travel over to the UK and be part of the Windrush generation. But I'm also an educator, and I'm really proud of that because I feel that there isn't a profession in the world better than education, because we teach everybody everything and everybody needs to learn something. So to be part of a profession and an opportunity where I'm able to educate the next generation and really have an impact on the future, that's really important to me. And that's really been important in regards to the legacy of those who've come before us, the knowledge and the power and the information that they've passed down to us that has allowed us to grow and become better human beings as time has passed on. I'm also a mum, so this isn't just professional for me, this is personal. I have two boys, one who is 13 and one who is 10. And as black boys, it's really important for me to recognise what their position is in today's society and question how much has it changed since their great-great-great-grandparents and their journey and their experience. So I'm hoping a little bit of information about me and my journey will help to kind of give you an understanding of my connection with education and why the Windrush generation is so important to me. So who are the Windrush generation? It's quite interesting because I looked for a definition that would sum them up, and I couldn't find one that was fitting, but I decided instead to just go with the factual information which was there, which was they arrived between a certain time period. They are put to a period in time, 1984 to 1973. But I think when we just look at a set of our community members in such a binary way, we take away from their commitment and their contribution. And we have to understand that after the Second World War, the NHS was desperate for this workforce. The labour, they needed it, they needed the construction, and they found that in the Caribbean. And so when I look at that generation, they're more to me than numbers. They're more to me than a period of time. They're more than a scandal. But what they are my ancestors. And I absolutely stand on the shoulder of giants. And I'm so grateful for their hard work, their sacrifice, and their commitment. Because let's be frank, without them, there is no us. Without them, there certainly is no me. So that's really important. So I thought I'd share a little portion of my family tree with you. So I am now 5 generations in the UK. So my great-grandparents on my maternal side, and they came to the UK in the mid-50s, and it was an interesting experience for them. My great-grandparents went through the real struggles that we hear about, that we can only possibly consider how hard it must have been for them. No cats, no dogs, no blacks, no Irish. That was their experience, going for a job, turning up, and then being turned away when they arrive and they see a black person standing there. And yet the advertisement said, no experience necessary, come on board. Being told that you didn't pass a test, or going and working in an organization and being called monkey, and yet somehow having to accept that because they were just supposed to be here. I think about how that trauma has been transferred and how it's gone from generation to generation, what my grandparents experienced, what my parents experienced, what I still experience today, and what I'm fighting to change for my children, and yet they've still had those experiences. And so it's important for me when I think about the generations in the UK, because I recently completed a form, and the form said, please identify, please say how you would acknowledge yourself. And I was looking, and yet, even though I'm 5 generations in regards to myself and my children, we can still only put Black British. We don't get to just choose to be British. So the question to me was, well, how long do we have to be here to be British? But the moment I say I'm just British, do I erase my Caribbean heritage? Do I erase the generation? And that's really important to me. But when I really focus on the Windrush generation, I focus on the women. And these women here really sum up for me hope. Women who sacrifice so much. The women who make me who I am. So the picture at the top is my great-grandmother. Her name was Miriam, and she came to the UK in the mid-50s, and they came to set up. They sent for their first set of children. They had 9 children in total, and they sent for my great-aunt and great-uncle to come to the UK, and some of the children didn't want to come. So my great-grandmother flew back to Jamaica, and she actually brought over what is my grandmother and 2 of her siblings to the UK, having left her children behind, all 9 of them, all over Jamaica while she was trying to settle in the UK. And then I looked to both of my grandparents who came here in the 60s, women who worked really hard to make a difference. My nan was an auxiliary nurse, and she was part of that backbone of the NHS. You know, looking at the work she did it with such pride. She worked endless shifts. She had 3 children under the age of 21 and still had to work and manage. Lived in a house where there was 10 or so people, and knowing that you had to just share and make do, because that's what you did as a community. You looked after each other, you looked after each other's children. That's what you did. My grandmother, we worked in a factory. That was her experience. And so when I look at my grandparents today, and both of them I'm very fortunate to have alive, I look at them and I see that generation. I see their sacrifice and I see their commitment, and it's such a beautiful thing to witness. But as part of my research for this, I began to talk to them about what was education like for them. And that was a really interesting conversation, because what they began to tell me was that whilst they came to the UK with such hope and aspiration, education was difficult for them. Training was not available to them because of the colour of their skin. But actually, having children in the education system was hard. In those days, children could still be hit by their teacher. And having to deal with that, having to deal with my mum being told she couldn't be an angel because angels weren't black, they were only slaves. Having to go through those experiences and challenging the education system when your child is being told they're subnormal, but having nowhere to challenge it. Having to deal with the fallout when programs came out such as Roots, and there was the reaction and how it affected black children, but how it also, the responses from white children. My grandma just told me how my uncle went to Monk's Park, and they used to refer to it as Monkey's Paradise. These were all their educational experiences. And so I think about myself today, and I think about those who stand before me in education, and I refer to 2 really significant women for me. I refer to Yvonne Connolly, who was the first black head teacher in the UK, but also Hyacinth Hall, who was the first black head teacher in Bristol. And I think about the sacrifices that they made, looking for my research and looking at articles referring to them as black head teachers, coloured head teachers who were known purely for their skin colour and not for their significant contributions. And I think about the curriculum today and the contributions of black teachers, and I have to ask myself, how far have we come? How much has changed? How much is different when we think about what they've been through and we think about their experiences? And so I think about myself and I think about, well, what I've been through, and I think about the historical struggle. And I think back to the generation of the Windrush, and I think about the British education system, and I think about how they were in a system that was supposed to have responsibility and care and compassion, and yet it didn't do that for all of them. That sense of connectivity and belonging wasn't there. They felt that they didn't belong. It was fueled with extremely low expectations, low attainment, exclusion from school, and no support. And then I have to ask myself, well, how much has it changed? Now, in 2018, I did a documentary with the BBC that found that in Bristol specifically, there were 26 black teachers in our secondary schools, and 9 out of 10 didn't have any at all. And I look at the attainment rates of black children, and particularly black and Afro-Caribbean children are still performing at a lower rate. And yet when you look at the way in which they go into the education system, they are not at the bottom when they enter. So what does the system do to those children? How does it continue to fail the Windrush generation and the legacy that they've tried to build? I think about my TED talk I did in 2019 that questioned around representation and does it matter? And looking at the racism that existed from generation to generation, some of that my children still experience today. But then I look for the hope, and I see the hope in becoming the director of Representation Matters and working with schools and educational establishments to really challenge what they believe education to be and challenge the experiences that black children are having today. It's about being able to be a role model and demonstrate to them that there is hope and there's opportunity, and letting them know how amazing they are and that they can succeed. It's about challenging the curriculum, because the superficial condensed view that we have right now celebrates a few significant characters and celebrates a few activists. But what it doesn't do is allow our children to understand. How is it that our children can know about particular elements of the curriculum but not know about it all? Why is it not inclusive enough? They know about Thomas Edison, but they don't know about Lewis Law. They will hear about slavery and think that that's the beginning of their existence, but won't know about Beachy Head Lady, won't know about Cheddar Man, won't know about Ivory Bangle Lady. So when we think about what they're taught and what they're not taught, what does that do to their psyche? And I created a project with the One Bristol curriculum that was to challenge this, and we looked at the African Diaspora, and what we did is we said, we're going to use Africa to enlighten ourselves and question, well, what is in her? And what we did is we did what's in a name, and we allowed our children to investigate who they were. And what they did as part of that opportunity is that I told them the story of my neighbor who's called Whisper, and he comes from Zimbabwe. And he explained to me that in Zimbabwe, they named their children after who they want them to become. And he said that he was the 10th child for his grandparents, or for his parents, and his grandparents said, we want a quiet child. But that was a beautiful experience, because what it meant is that we were able to talk about what does that mean. And children were looking at different names. And in Zimbabwe, we were looking at names that meant billionaire. There were names that were like Precious and Diamond, but it meant that every child could then investigate who they were. What did their names mean? Why was it significant? And why did it contribute? And so when I think about empowering children, we need to look at all the contributions of our generation. And we think about the richness and diversity that comes from food, that comes from music, that comes from culture, all of which we can see the influences of our Caribbean Windrush generation and the significance that they've contributed. So it's important for us that whilst we want to strive forward and we want to progress, we mustn't forget some of the deeper historical struggles. And whilst we want to look to success and we want to challenge the education system and we truly want inclusivity for all, we want to see that it moves forward, and we want to see our children flourish and grow because they deserve to be the best version of themselves. We mustn't forget the sacrifices that were made. We mustn't forget what they went through. While we ended up with things such as the St. Paul's Rite, Yeah. So when we think about St. Paul's riots and we think about all that has happened, what we have to understand is what impact that has had. And we think about what they had to do to fight and challenge. And we think tomorrow is Stephen Lawrence Day, and we must think about what his murder meant. And we mustn't forget that. We mustn't forget the Macpherson report. And even as part of that report, whilst they referred to the police, they referred to education. And they talked about the system and what needed to change. And so we must look at the contributions and we must look at the experiences and we look at how far we've come. But what we must also do is remember the shoulder of giants that we stand on and the contributions that they've made to education. And so what I close by saying is, I salute those before me. I'm so grateful for the contributions of the generation that came before. And I'm so grateful for the sacrifices that they made. I wouldn't be the assistant principal I am today if my grandparents didn't make the sacrifices that they made for me to be here. They cleaned toilets, they were auxiliary nurses, they worked in factories, they had doors shut in their faces, and they continued. It would have been a big ask to not go back to Jamaica, but instead they stayed because they felt it would be better. They stayed because they felt that there was an opportunity, and they stayed because they wanted better for their children and their great-grandchildren in the future. And so when I look at my nan today, and I look at my grandma, and they say, Aisha, you've made us proud because you are the reason we made the sacrifice. And I look at them and say, but if it wasn't for you, there wouldn't be me. Thank you.
Wow, that's actually a wonderful speech that deserves an audience at kind of Bristol Cathedral. That was fantastic. Thank you so much for pulling that together, and so much there. And I hope you know, those in the audience can get your questions ready. So that some of the highlights was obviously you're the fifth generation. Makes me another grey hair pop up. So number two, so that's okay. So I'm just keeping that personal. On the very standing on soldier giants, but the women came through. The school teachers. That's a new one. Monks Park is not far from where I'm sitting now, and lots of people go into Monks Park. I didn't know Monkey Park as well. I know Pat Rose who spoke at the last one is a Meader from Southmead. So yeah, I have to run that past. That was a shock, and it's interesting because I'm doing some fiction work at the moment, and part of that tough working class humor, which was we saw in things like Horribly in Love, but they thought they were like mini comedians, but they would always make these slightly, we would now know them as microaggressions, Aisha.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
Monkey Park and all that. They thought they were making jokes. They would make a joke of it wouldn't be good enough to call you the N-word or worse. They would make sure they would embed it in there, and that's what really, it's like a real like a slap to you. But those were you spoke, which we're going to speak about, and especially with the connection of the trial of George Floyd and successful conviction, but also that you reference the Macpherson report as well, but the disparity report that we kind of have to reference because education and how that was distorted. From someone that I used to admire, Dr. Tony Sewell, who was an educationist, former columnist and writer in The Voice, and then now turned. So you have a kind of big smorgasbord there on the eve, as you mentioned, of Stephen Lawrence's anniversary, April 22nd, 1993. And Stephen Lawrence Day, the first one tomorrow. But kind of, first of all, let's start with Stephen before we go US. And good to see that, as far as I'm concerned, popping up in Line of Duty this week. Spoiler alert in that reference. But what is that legacy kind of in terms of his murder, first of all? Because, and we're still getting it. People still think it's an American problem because of the numbers. But we have to point back to say that this was what happened to Stephen was kind of regular occurrence. We've got our own tragedy in Marlon Thomas. You live in the city that produced that, and the Wilson family are there as well, and the work of Sari. So how has that kind of affected your your teaching and your activism in terms of the murder and the lack of a conviction for Stephen Lawrence? How has that shaped your path, first of all?
I think that the thing is, I think for me, I use free images that really help, particularly when I think about education. I'm trying to get children to really visualize. And the first image I use is a picture of a black swan. And I put it up and children said, "Oh, miss, does that exist?" And I'm like, yeah, black swans exist. And sometimes that's how I see racism, in that we know it exists, we know it's there, but because people don't feel they overtly see it, particularly in comparison to the way that they believe it exists within the US, there is that it's not here, it's not happening. But what that image does for me is it reminds us that even if you cannot see it, it doesn't mean that it's not there. And then that brings me to my second picture that I really like to use, which is the elephant in the room, particularly an image of an elephant kicking over chairs. And the reality is it's always there. Racism doesn't disappear. We don't forget about Marlon Thomas. We don't forget about Stephen Lawrence. There are many, many, many Black people within the UK that we could list. We could spend our entire time talking about all the tragedies that we know have happened. But what happened from time to time is the chairs get kicked over. And what happened certainly last year was when George Floyd was murdered, and we had the reinsurgence of Black Lives Matter, because it didn't start in 2020, although people might believe that's the case. The reality is it forced it and it thrust it in our faces. And whether you wanted to be a part of it or not, you had to be part of the debate. It was in your face. It was on the news. It was on the radio. It was on the front of our papers. It was even weaving its way into our TV programs we were watching, even in fictional context. It was being referenced and it was being discussed. But the final image I like to use is a picture of a rhino, because a rhino often will be a metaphor for threat. And sometimes when people are threatened, they don't know what to do. And that sometimes comes down to people's core beliefs. Do I fight it? Do I run away from it? Do I freeze? Or do I fawn and just go along with it? So what's really important for me is when I think about young people, it's important that we don't forget. It is so easy to say, because it's not overt, because it's microaggressions, because it doesn't feel like it's on the forefront of our minds all of the time, that it's not happening. But that does a disservice to all the generations before and the lives that are taken if we are not honest about our history and our experiences. We must be truthful about what has happened. We must speak truth to power. And we must also understand that power is ultimately knowledge, and knowledge is power. And if you don't ensure that they have that information, they don't understand the legacy that they're standing on. They don't know the ancestors that came before, and they don't know how amazing they are and what they can achieve. So when I think about Black children and they feel that they haven't progressed much and they feel that they haven't been successful, I say, do you know how hard it must have been? Years and years of slavery, for it to be abolished, to then have to go through the treatment of slavery that was slavery under another name, to have to go through and leave your children behind, to rebuild a country, to have to go through prejudice while that's all happening. You've been through things. It might not look like success in the sense of the cars or property, tangible things, but there's a success in your spirit. And that's right down to your cellular level.
Absolutely, and that's some great wise words. Your three animals: the elephant in the room, in the middle, the rhino tipping things over, and then the kind of black swan of that rarity. Some great metaphors there. So, and I need to say her name in Breonna Taylor as well, in terms of the murder and lifelessness of those Black bodies. I want to stay in this country though. When we're looking at reports, is my next point, because there was the famous Cord report on the education of West Indian children, as we were called way back then. And as you said, because no wonder we didn't grow up entirely rooted to the country, because we were all others. We were either Afro-Caribbean or Western Indian children. The fact that we were born here. So, and you mentioned that in your talk in terms of the sentence, and maybe you lose something. I think I claim both sides. So I don't the black diaspora, which is the blackness, and the Britishness of the country I'm born in. But I wanted to go to reports, and the code report on unruly primarily black boys, right up until the recent race disparity report, and get your thoughts of that. But sandwiched in the middle, there's been so many reports, particularly from you referenced Macpherson, we had the Lammy one recently. We're 40 years since the Brixton riots. So you had the Scarman report into then. I wouldn't mind if there was some action taken on any of these things.
Yeah, there's so many reports. Yeah, it's true. There's so many reports.
Yeah, and speaking to or watching the program from Steve McQueen, again using culture, which was the last one was education, which was Steve McQueen, who's a knight, who's a Turner Prize winner, an Oscar winner, had dyslexia. He could have fallen through the cracks. He didn't. He came through, and he came across this code report and made a film about it in his past. What I wanted to was get your thoughts on and contextualize it within a variety of reports, particularly around education. Let's bring in some of the things that we're talking about here in terms of decolonizing the curriculum, the work that Elise is doing in terms of the rewarding gap, Mian, my colleagues, in terms of just being a kind of black and Asian presence within the university to diversify by that. Let's get your thoughts in on a kind of range of really tackling the institutional racism that you referenced there, and it's picked up in all of those reports.
I think the reality is, there are so many reports we can list. There's so many reports that have different opinions. But when you think about it, Mark Twain has a quote, and he refers to data because reports often have a lot of data in them. And he talks about the fact that data is garbage unless you know what you're going to do with the content. And the reality is, often these reports are here to present a narrative. And that's what can be quite dangerous, particularly when you think about the most recent report that almost demonizes and gaslights black communities and almost makes it out as if to say black communities, particularly the reference to black Caribbean communities, are just being victims and are not progressing and won't let the past go. And that's really, really important, because what we need to really consider is what it does when you continue to perpetuate those ideas. We don't need another report to tell us what we already know. Instead, what we need to do is look at the real lived experiences and really look at what data and research is out there that tells you that this is real. This is what is actually happening. This is what the curriculum is actually presenting. Whether it was the bias, that we saw within the postcodes in regards to students' results last year as a result of the pandemic, where you lived would determine what grades you would get. And yet people would argue that the education system, there are enough reports to tell us it's not biased, that it's not racist. But we know the thing with racism is that it hits every fabric of our society. And that's what makes it difficult. And that's what people don't want to address, because racism is everywhere. It's in everything that we do. And whether we're talking about the police, education, we're talking about health services, it is all there. And then what happens is that when you are continually, as it feels, challenging it, when we are having to download our experiences to let people know what it feels like to be us, to be re-triggered and re-traumatized, and then it's, well, we've had enough of it. We don't want to hear that anymore. But you need to ask yourself this, but when do I stop being black? Because I don't. When do I zip off my black skin? I don't. So even if you don't want to talk about it anymore, it is still my experience. So whether that's from conception, when black women are losing children who are dying at a higher rate than their white counterparts, whether it's the disproportionate amount of black children that are in prison currently, 38% of there's 52% of black and Asian minority ethnic children in prison right now, 38% of which are black. Why is there a disproportionate amount, yet they don't make up the proportion of black children within the UK system? You look at exclusions, more likely to be excluded if you're a black Caribbean child particularly. We look at the police, more likely to be stopped. So people will argue and say that racism doesn't exist, or why do we need to still talk about it? But the reality speaks for itself. Because in every facet of society, Black people are always getting the worst deal. So I guess my question back would be, well, help me to understand how that is still the case.
Absolutely, and that's what I think that's what we kind of did say in response, and as if, like I say, been, as you mentioned, being a gaslit. When you heard of the recent report, so-called Stewart report, how did you feel when you walked in? Not with your colleagues, as I know they would have known, and I know you as a resilient individual, but did you feel your job was made as an educator made easier or harder?
Harder, absolutely harder from an educator perspective, but also as somebody who set up a company which is trying to get organizations to challenge their levels of inclusivity, and yet I have a report that says it's not needed. I have a report that says, well, why are you doing what you're doing? You can stop it. It's fair, isn't it? It's all equal. We don't need to do this anymore. But what we come back to is the reality. And actually, we need to look at the real experiences of these communities. We need to move from equality, which is just giving everybody the same. It's about equity and knowing what people need. But you know what we really need? We need liberation. Because liberation is what allows everybody, not just Black people, but everybody to be the best versions of themselves. But what often happens is when Black people challenge just to get enough, just to get the same, the argument is you're asking for more. We're not asking for more. We're asking that we get to start at the same level playing field, that we are not continually in this position where we are starting so far behind. When you look back in generations and people talk about the fact that, well, if Black people, you've had the same opportunities. And then I have to ask people, do you know what year Black people were allowed to vote? Do you know what year Black people were allowed to have education? Do you know what year Black people were able to inherit property? Do you know what year Black people were able to own companies? Because when you begin to see that those dates are not that far back, you begin to realize that even when slavery was abolished, we were still shackled by the system. And that's what we have to be honest about. Because it isn't starting from the same place. We're all starting from different starting points.
Absolutely. That's again another a great response. I want to talk about moving from reports and taking on board your action. So your family played a big part in your kind of career, and in terms of you famously went through law, gave up that for your educational side. What are we seeing in terms of education within the within the families? To my mind, I think it's got more of a priority than ever. So is that the experience on the ground of people? Because I never took it on board. I mean, I was told often enough that you have to have an education, but it passed me by. I left school without any qualifications until it was too late. Literally until the school gates closed is when I kind of woke up. I'm one of the kind of lucky ones. Other ones weren't so resilient. Do you think that with more and more going into university, and we're going to talk about that career path shortly, do you feel that is grasped now by our it's always been grasped, certainly by our Asian families, but also by our Caribbean families? Is that different to what's been said in the report? What's your real life experience?
We're beginning to see a shift, but not enough of a shift.
Right.
What we see pockets of families who have the access to the knowledge, the experience, they have the encouragement where they are able to see that education is important to the success of their children. And when I say education, I'm not just talking about formative education. I'm talking about life experience. I'm talking about financial literacy. I'm talking about the ability to understand what life genuinely needs in every facet. And that's really important. And I'm seeing parents who are allowing themselves to be more open-minded also. So it isn't just about lawyer, doctor, accountant. They are considering other professions. They're allowing their children to have that creativity and that success. But what they're also seeing is representation. Now, representation in itself can be tokenistic. I'm going to be quite frank. Says the woman who has a jumper that says representation matters. But what I'm saying is it can be performative and it can be virtue signaling if it is only used as a form of saying we've added diversity. It has to be part of a process. It has to be part of a set of changes. It has to be part of a culture. Putting a Black person in a job in itself is not enough. But allowing that Black person to feel a sense of belonging and inclusivity, for them to genuinely have their voice heard and genuinely begin to shift the culture, but also be able to be an example and put down that ladder to the next generation, now that is powerful. And so what we do here is we pass the baton. We pass the baton to the next person that comes along to make sure we keep on including them in the processes and the opportunities. And we talk about nepotism, and I think it's worth mentioning it, because nepotism, particularly in white middle class communities, and I think it's worth referencing, is there's this idea that we're going to keep helping you to do well because we're going to keep it within our circles and within our spaces. We see it in Asian communities too. But with Black Caribbean communities in particular, you don't see that as much. And we have to understand why. It's because of the journey and where they started. And whilst we're seeing more of that, we need to capitalize on that and begin to network and grow. I talk about having 4 people in your life that are really important. One is about having your confidant or your friend, your cheerleader, that person who really is there to be by your side, particularly in moments of struggle and stress when you just feel like you can't keep going, when that resilience isn't there. Person number 2 is your mentor, that person who's doing what you want to do, but is a bit further ahead in the journey and is helping you to get there. Person number 3 is your sponsor, that person who can open doors for you, smash ceilings open and allow you to step through. But person number 4 is really important to me, and that's a therapist. You do not have to have a mental health crisis to have a therapist, and often there is that kind of stigma attached to it. But what a therapist does is it allows you to unpack the trauma. Now we, particularly as Black Caribbeans, need to understand the trauma we carry. We carry generational trauma. We carry the trauma and the legacy of slavery at a cellular level, and sometimes we don't even appreciate or understand that it is there. Things affect us and we're triggered and we don't know why. And it's because it's there within, the same way we inherit looks, the same way we can inherit illnesses, you can inherit pain, you can inherit trauma. And it's important that, particularly us within the Black Caribbean community, we address how it makes us feel. We cannot underestimate when a child is seeing images and images and images of Black children being kicked out of school, what does that do to their psyche? When children are seeing on TV the brutalization of the Black body, what does that do to their psyche? So we must look at mental health alongside education when we think about empowering our families. So yes, they are improving, in answer to your question, but I still think there's work we can do to make that improvement even stronger.
It's kind of interested in one of your points that you make about kind of nepotism and tokenism as well, but I always reverse it, because when you talk about representation, nobody questions the sons of or the daughters of a boss or an uncle there, or the thing that was said at the golf course. Nobody talks about representation, least of all meritocracy, least of all level of the playing field. The playing field is crooked.
Absolutely.
It's only us who start like, oh well, we want to get in there, and women go through the same thing. Oh well, am I a token? Well, I'm always, and Jean Joyner has said this as well. Just get me through the door, and I don't care whichever way, because you know, I know that whether it's the City of London or otherwise, these things used to go on. That's how I've worked with plenty of people who've been well over promoted. Let's move to you said we a lot. Let's talk about what your organization is doing to actually directly tackle it and importantly empower you. I've asked you about the journey, but talk a little bit about your the work that you're currently doing, the projects and like to do that alongside, of course, teaching.
Yeah, absolutely. So still a teacher, so being a teacher in itself allows that representation, but it also means I'm planting seeds. It means that I'm growing the next generation. It means I can fill them with knowledge and information. I can challenge their thinking, and that's a beautiful position to be in. I love the fact that when I talk to our children, I get to excite them about who they are and what they can contribute to the world, whether you're Black or white, whether you're Asian, whether you're Muslim, whether you're Christian, just celebrating what makes you you. And that is the premise of Representation Matters, which is really about, until society recognizes you for who you are, you will always question where you belong. And so what the business does is we really focus on helping leadership teams in particular in organizations to go through that transformation and really take them through a journey of understanding, where are you now, what do you need to do, and how do you ensure you hold yourself to account. So you're not just throwing up a black square, but you're actually making a long-lasting difference that has legacy. And it's about coaching and workshops that help organizations to do that. But in addition to that, particularly within the education system, I recently set up a project called Beyond the 26, which is really about saying, yes, there were 26 black teachers, but there are many, many, many educators who don't have the label teacher who are in our education system. And so we were celebrating, particularly for Black History Month, every single day, a different educator. And we continue to showcase all the amazing people of color who are working in different job roles, whether it's an ed psych, whether it's a lecturer, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a pastoral support worker, and letting you know that they are there and they exist. They are just hidden and they need to be shown in all of their glory. And then my other project has been about repping your representation. It's about people standing forward and saying, this is what makes me me, and I'm going to celebrate that richness and that beauty, and I'm really going to shout it from the rooftops, and I'm going to be unapologetic about it. And it's giving people a platform to feel confident in order to do so. So we've recently been doing some empowerment courses, particularly for women and also for Black women, really helping them to really kind of capitalize on who they are, but helping them to smash the ceiling and go through to the next stage of their career and the journey.
Fantastic. I'm going to throw it open to questions shortly, but my final question to you was, obviously you've gone through the route, you're fully aware of it in terms of the higher education. So you know, how can we assist you? What should be organisations like you, Bristol, your former alumni, how can we do better and improve, not only to assist you, but but also assist those students into higher education? Also, what do we do when we get them there? It's one thing getting them there, but obviously we've got a higher dropout rate. What are the type of things that you would advise that we can we're armed to tell our bosses and in terms of the fight for resources?
But one of the most important things is awareness, and awareness as soon as possible. We get to the point of higher education too late. My son is 10 now. He should already be having a conversation about his future, what academia could look like for him, what his opportunities may be. He's not getting that. And often it's a very small cohort of children who might get that trip to the university, they might get that odd project. But when you're thinking about the disproportionate number of children who are not having access, and they don't have an auntie, an uncle, a mum or a dad in the household who already have this level of education, or it's very limited, we need to do that early awareness as soon as possible. I would say right down to nursery. As early as you can do it, the better, because you need to have that continuation of the conversation about the significance of education and what that can do, the access it can provide for you. I think that the next thing that's really important for me is again about representation, but it's about representation at all levels. It's not enough just to focus at particular levels within the education system. We need to see educational improvement at senior leadership level. We need to see more professors. We need to see universities that are being led by people of color. We need to see that, because that is what actually affects systems and structures. We need those voices in the room so that when decisions are being made, when decisions and policies and strategies are being written, you have a diverse room of thought. And that's really important. What's also important is not continually to gaslight particular communities and say, well, you're not applying. That's a real cop-out to say you're not applying. It's not just about that. You have to understand that there is a history here. If they're not applying, do the work to find out why they're not applying and really connect with those young people and really look at their barriers. And then when they do get there, look after them. We talk about recruitment and retention. Well, that applies to HE too. How much are we retaining those students and truly giving them their support? And that's where it comes back to that therapy point of view. It is very hard. Many of the children, particularly if you've been in a diverse secondary school or a diverse primary school, you go into university and it's a shock for them. particularly on certain degrees. I mean, certainly when I did my law degree, there was very few of us. And the reality is that can be quite daunting. Where is the support in the system to help me stay? Where does that exist? That is really important as well. And then my final thing is financial. Going to higher education is expensive. So where are the opportunities to support people, be it with scholarships and bursaries, to really help them to get into university? Because it's not a cheap route of education. So often it is not something you can do because you can't afford to get there. But taking a loan and coming out of university with £30,000 worth of debt, that's really hard. That's a hard commitment to make.
Absolutely, and it's good to see. I've been working on the Paul Stevenson bursary and Dean's bursary, any small amounts, but at least it's something, and we're just about to do some publicity on those. But so awareness early, right down into nursery, is great. Representation, things that are led by people of colour, the support once they're there, something Aisha mentions all of the time, and financial. So we've got our 5 tips. I am almost running out of ink on my pad. It is like I've been making. So time to hand over to a few members of our audience. And Aisha, I just wonder if you want to respond on some of those points, and just for the recording, just talk about the support and the support that you do, and how just to hammer home Aisha's point on that, please. You're able to say a few words on that, or Mian, you if you would, and any either of are you around to speak? Right there.
Okay, I will come in. Having a young black man in my son is a young black man. He experienced a lot of the things that you've described, Aisha, during his school years, and it's always been a challenging time for me and my husband while he was growing up. He went to a very high-performing school when he was young, and then because he has some learning difficulties, he was isolated by the school to sit in the hall by himself, and that had created we didn't know about it till some parents told us about it. We were so angry, and eventually we took him out of the school. What I'm trying to say is there are a lot more young black children who perhaps the school misunderstood the way they behave is naughtiness, but in fact, when he was in year 1, year 2, he's a lively and yeah, fun boy at that age, and it's so little being done, even right until now, that young black children are being considered as disruptive and also not engaging and all that, and it has affected his learning throughout his teenage years. And I couldn't agree with you more that there should be more sort of role models and more black teachers in schools and even throughout education to support young people, young black people who may need some support. Some of them may have some educational needs, but that's not catered for. Straight away, they were considered as naughty and not engaging. That's a label that they had to carry a long way, and that puts them off in education, I think. It's so refreshing to hear what you said.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Roger, I am here. I was in the kitchen, so I had to come through to the living room, cooking for my son. So yeah, I think in regards to the role I do, I think what Aisha brought up some really key points, and I do think one we don't talk about as much as we talk about recruitment, so recruiting, getting more and more in, but we don't look at retention as much. And I do think in my role it's been very much about how do we retain those students, how do we make them have a sense of belonging in this university. And I think those people will be the ones, once we retain them and actually keep them in our university and make them feel a sense of belonging, will go out and say, actually come and study at university with us. So my role, what I do is about how do I create that sense of belonging, and I do that in a number of ways. So I recruit what I call BAME student advocates, and they run a number of BAME student meetup groups, and that's just for students to come together and actually talk about things that are bothering them, but also having a space where they can celebrate their success. Because I think when you are a wide participation student, getting through an assignment when you've got a million other things going on actually is a huge success, and we need to be celebrating, and they need to have space to do that, to celebrate in. So I do very much about how do I keep the students here and make them feel wanted, needed, role models within their community. So going out, for example, we have a Ujima takeover show happening next month, where I'm going to have a number of BAME students coming on to speak about their experience, and that's from our policing program to philosophy. And I think it's really key that we actually start engaging some of our students, in particular our BAME students, with the Bristol BAME community, because we don't have the staff at UE at the moment, but actually we have a huge community in Bristol where we should be tapping into, which is why Roger knows how passionate I am about a series such as this, because now, for example, if students are here, they can see people like Aisha within our community who are doing amazing things, and look at how do they connect with people like Aisha and people like Andalora. So very much about my support is it is about going out and recruiting students, but again, it's about how do we keep a hold of our students and make them thrive while they're with us at UE.
So, absolutely, and that's why we've got the project as another thing to kind of support people back. You should do what your response. Any tips for your fellow educational sister in more ways than one?
I think it's about making sure. I mean, I look at the work that Aisha and I actually been on the radio together before, which was really powerful. But it is about having enough time to be able to celebrate the wins, and I think that's such an amazing point to mention. And is what I talked about in the talk in the beginning, which is we don't celebrate the small things because it doesn't feel big enough in comparison. And actually, if I can just get to university every day for every lecture, that might be a massive win for me because of the context I'm coming from, because of the barriers that I've had to entry, because I might have to support my family. I might have to work a part-time job. Those privileges are not extended to everybody, and sometimes disproportionately affect Black and Asian communities. So it's really important that that opportunity is there to celebrate that diversity, but also those wins, those successes, and that's really important. But it's also, when we think about that idea of retention, it's they will become your ambassadors just because you invest in them and give them the best experiences possible. They will literally shout from the rooftops how amazing your organization, how amazing your university is, because they've had such a great experience. So it's not always about short-term wins, it's about long-term gains and giving them what they need to shout about you and say, yes, you is where I want to be.
Absolutely. Mian, you want to come back in, or is that just a hand up?
Yes, I was going to say, in the field that I'm doing, we do not have a lot of students of color in my department. We are trying to encourage with our students from different cultures to work on projects like the Windrush projects, to bring them together to connect with the communities. And also because of the lack of diversity, I in my work I try to bring communities into the for example, I work in art and design. I try to bring in communities in the design studio working with students, not just students of color, but also majority white students. So they also have a connection as well. It's two ways. Should be a connection from white students learning there are talented artists from outside that can be just as good as a white artist. So I try to do both ways as well for the work that I do.
Excellent. Okay, so I know another person who's got to go and prepare food this evening. Jane Andrews, our guest there. I just wanted, Tom, just one of the viewers just want to put a final question. Jane, I know you're an educator as well. You're in the business of kind of training our future teachers. I was delighted to do a lecture for you last week. What's observations have you got and questions, the final questions for Aisha before she goes to be with her family?
Sure, thank you very much. Thanks, Roger, and thanks, Aisha, again. Just a very, very inspiring presentation. So thank you. And it makes me sort of realise that there are so many levels that we've got to think about here. So what you were talking about, it's it's big enough to think about working with leaders, but that's not enough either. And so I really appreciated your expanding our vision of what we're working at here, and also talking about inheritance and heritage and what we're working with and what people carry with them. But if I wanted to just pick on one thing, I really liked what you talked about action and bringing it right to working with children, and something as, on the one hand, profound, but also simple, as like working with children's names. Where do names come from? Where do our names come from? Let's go to countries and communities and find out about their practices there, because what I really like about that is, I think, it's about respect, isn't it? And finding out, all of us, finding out, educating ourselves, and using that as the topic for education. And I think it's empowering, and it's also outward looking. And I think that's something we can do in higher education. It works, in education of all ages, doesn't it? Because it's starting with us and valuing ourselves, and just sort of teasing out what is that person who sits next to me? What's special about them, their name, and not taking for granted that we all know each other, really, actually. So I suppose I'm just sharing back to you that I really appreciate the examples of actions that we can kind of do more work at that level, as well as working on the society level to combat, the racism that's everywhere. But it can work down the levels from high up down to the everyday action. So I think what for me it says is, we don't need to wait for someone to do this for us. We don't need to wait for society to get better. We need to make it better in every moment that we're together. So I'm waffling a bit now, but just thank you, Aisha. I really, really enjoyed the presentation and the session. So thank you.
Oh no, thank you very much.
Need a change you can see, and that's certainly sums up your work, Aisha. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I'm going to have to shoot now myself. Actually, I've got another event at 7:15.
I know. We book another time. You were strict to 7 o'clock. We started at 5 minutes late, so we've had your strict hour. So we really appreciate it on behalf of you. Thanks very much. We'll get the recording to you. Really appreciate. Round of applause, please, for Aisha.
No, thank you, and I appreciate your time. We may have been small in number, but mighty in what we can do. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.